Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of History for Roleplayers. And yes, it's been a little while since I put one together. My mind is always scattershot. I'm actually always working, and if you're interested in some of my games, you could look for them on Drive-Thru RPG, or you could look for my stories, the stories my wife and I have written on Kindle. They're also available on through Prime as a free reading. Lastly, you could even find some of our books as we start to narrate them and put them up online in YouTube. But back on topic, forgive the sales pitch, but I don't actually need the cash, but it's nice to have some fame, so hit that like key and please subscribe. But let's get back to the history of roleplay, and let's talk for a little bit about Middle-earth. Now, I've actually talked to people who thought Middle-earth was real, and that does actually speak well for JRR Tolkien, and his ability to put together a very fascinating world. Unfortunately, what he also did was he ruined fantasy for about everyone else to follow. The books, both The Lord of the Rings and most of the fantasy stories that will follow, they're written like Bibles, and you can't even have a continuity error in them because they're just scrutinized so fanatically. The realms have to be far and wide, and there's much of the world that is yet to be imagined. Are you leaving room for sequels here? Bah on that. I mean, who's got the time? Only a few book-a-day savants ever get to digest any of these things. The rest of us are just waiting for adaptations and the nudity punctuated in the HBO series. So Tolkien, he also wrecks RPGs as well. D&D is nothing if not an imagined world of dicing Middle-earth. Many a would-be Tolkien-esque DM has spent hundreds of hours making a campaign, when in reality all the players want to do is kill orcs, take some gold, roll some dice in between. The grand quest, especially a Tolkien-esque quest, is a solo journey. It's based on medieval sagas, Beowulf for one. It's really not conducive for any sort of group play. And, hey, look what happened to the 9 of the Fellowship. Now, I've been in many a situation where intramural homicide leads to party wipe. Yeah, many a time. Some of them I caused myself, I gotta say. Now, let's start by just looking at Tolkien's map. The quest is a zigzag. It splits the party in the middle. That could be a nice twist. But it did add an extra 3 books by splitting the party. Now, Lord of the Rings is 3 volumes of pairs of books. It really is 6 books. Now, people talk about the 3 books of the Lord of the Rings, but it's really 3 volumes of the Lord of the Rings. So when I talk about this, I'm going to be talking about book 1 and 2, that's volume 1, book 3 and 4, volume 2, and etc. And I got to admit, I never ever did get to the end of it. I've read The Hobbit many times. It's a wonderful story. But Lord of the Rings, it really plods. It's extremely wordy. It has 100 pages of appendixes. Many of the modern tales that follow are even worse, with near endless descriptions of people's clothing. I'll get back to some of my other topics, but does any of this really matter to plot? But if we look at Middle-earth, the first thing we have to realize about the whole thing, there's just too many neutral parties in the whole thing. And look at this map. There's whole kingdoms, whole economies. There's got to be some sort of shipping aspect. We know there was pirates that got taken over in the stories. If I'm assuming that there are other intelligent monsters similar to the Eagles, there's a whole realm of possibilities. And this is really a struggle with the Dark Lord. At least in Harry Potter, everyone knew that this was a life-changing event. But grand swaths of Middle-earth just seem like they're all self-absorbed. They're there just as window dressing. They don't have any skin in the game when, if Sauron gets the ring back, if it really is the one ring to rule them all, he could easily take over all of Middle-earth. So why aren't these other realms at least choosing a side? I mean, if they could at least become minions of the Dark Lord and have a better stance on what side of the pitchfork they're on when they're scouring the Shire. But as we look at all of this, you really have to start to wonder if Eriador, and forgive me if I don't pronounce any of these names correctly, but Eriador, and Ardor and Harlanden and Edned Waif these are even places bigger in landmass than Gondor. certainly bigger in landmass than Rohan or Lothlorien, they must have had armies, they must have had struggles, they must have had something that could have put into this saga. But essentially what's happened is that Tolkien, like many roleplay GMs, has just overly described his environment. What you're going to have in an environment like this is you have this great quest that you want the players to perform, but they're going to be running off into the northern waste. They're going to forget all about the ring. They're going to say, hey, what's in this corner of the map? So what I've done is I've taken the time to actually redraw Middle-earth, consolidated it to the powers that are actually mentioned in the saga. So here goes. And the first thing I think that we should look at when we consider Middle-earth is the fact that we got to find out if it has any sort of foundation. You know, Tolkien was a scholar, so things don't just get created in the vacuum. Just like with Robert E. Howard, you got to wonder, where on earth did he really have this situated? Now, there's been doctoral theses published on whether or not Tolkien was talking about World War I or the precursors in World War II, if there's any politics related to East Bloc, West Bloc, or fascism versus communism, you name it. But essentially what you have is that, is Eriador perhaps the continent like China, and the rest of the small area around Gondor is fighting a European Reformation? Are the Iron Hills with the dwarves? They do hint that there's a skirmish, I don't know if that was in the appendix or not, involving the dwarves, but they really don't have, they don't really take part. And the other thing that impresses me is the lack of any sort of social order. Are the rangers, the medieval cops, the only ones that are really taking care of everything? Or is there some sort of court and police system involved with it all? And when you look at Hobbiton, Hobbiton is just not isolated enough to be so unknown, so unguarded and left protected. You could say that Gandalf always kept half an eye on it, but Gandalf was always running off. I mean, he even abandoned poor Bilbo in the middle of The Hobbit. Maybe I'll do another series on that one. There are only 5 to maybe 10,000 horsemen of Rohan that arrive sort of late to the game to turn the tide. Why didn't any of the other men of the West get involved with this? Again, was it just logistics? Are we talking about scale that's even greater? No, I mean, when you look at the map, we're only talking about, 1,000 miles. 1,000 miles, it's a third of the United States. 1,000 miles you cross Europe, and certainly Crusades have gone farther than that. So, again, I'm trying to repreface this whole thing as more of a fantasy campaign that everyone can look at and make some critique on their own fantasy campaign. Alright, so let's decide what's going on here. First, let's ground this and decide again. I sort of get off track. I tend to work from notes, just an outline here. Medieval arms and attitudes. Middle-earth is medieval arms and attitudes. It's got a bit of a modern feel of the gentry, yet very pre-industrial revolution. Saruman could be, the person bringing in the industrial revolution. Certainly it's hinted in the adaptation, the movie, that he invented gunpowder. I view Saruman maybe as the Andrew Carnegie, and that he's instead of working in steel, he's working in flesh. He's trying to, he's like one of those TZ vampires in that game. Where do we find grassy plains with forests and long mountain ranges? Well, you got North America. We got the Rockies. The Rockies tend to be arid on both sides. They don't really have the plains. You got, the East Coast, the Appalachian Mountains, but again, the feel doesn't seem right. In colonial times, America was solid forests, top to bottom. The plains only came when they got out into, again, around the Mississippi River. But the Mississippi River is all flat, so if it's not the United States that he's set in, and I doubt as an English author he would have said in the United States, let's go to Europe. Now, really the main mountains in Europe are the Alps, and they tend to be a big chunk, maybe a circle at best. You got the Pyrenees blocking off Spain, but for the most part, you just don't have the construction. What you need is a spine. And that spine really only appears, it appears in Russia with the Ural Mountains, and the Misty Mountains could be the Ural Mountains. There's lots of rivers and marshes in Russia, but again, it just doesn't fit the feel of it. And what I realize is that if you just take England, and you take a map of England and flip it, on the horizontal plane, and certainly as a scholar, there'd be plenty of maps of England. Tolkien might have looked at one in a mirror, or might have just had one upside down, and the ink was so dark on the other side. Well, when you look at this, suddenly you see that there's a big spine of raised land, mountains, compared to the elevation of the other ones, that runs, from Scotland down to York, that central area. And then you have all of the area of the Welsh area, which could have been Mordor itself with that circle, and so it could be inspired by that. But to me, I'm not going to try to remake a map of Middle-earth. I want to try to work with the map that Tolkien had. And Tolkien, so let's erase it. Let's take out all of the red ink and leave it bare. And now you got the landmarks that he has. And I'm going to try to stay, somewhat true to that. It'd be nice if I could move one forest. If I could just move one forest, it would cause a lot of problems. But I think I worked this out. So again, I'm trying to draw a map of Middle-earth where the campaign in the map is solely on the novels. So where do we get started? Well, Book 1, in the realist world. Well, you start with the Shire. The Shire is the be-all, end-all. Now, I moved the Shire from where it is, and you should probably, if you don't have a copy of the Middle-earth map, you certainly can open one up with Google and maybe keep it on another tab. If you're interested, go back and forth, or if you're not interested and you're just listening to this at work, so be it. But the Shire, I moved farther. I moved all the way up to the coast. Now, those waters are reputed around there to be where the elves are going to sail to the, is it called the Grey Havens? I think it's called the Grey Havens. Well, they're going to sail to their heaven across the ocean. And so the waters in that area probably could be protected, one, just by isolation. Hobbiton does not appear to be a trading colony in any way, shape, or form. All the farming seems to be locally consumed. So I moved the Shire protected by this mountain range, and not on the coast, but close to the coast. Those coasts could be very rocky and tall, no safe port haven. Doesn't seem like there's any major water river that dumps in that area. So all the elevation sort of shows that the hydraulics of the area that I put the Shire in flows all the water south, and that would make sense. The mountains look very impenetrable. When you see any mountains in these maps, you should assume that you just can't cross over them, unless there are specific places you can. So we have the Shire more in an isolated area, and as you'll see as I fill in the book itself, you'll see how isolated it is. If you're playing this as a campaign, your players as well should start in the Shire, and then you're going to have a natural feel that as you move away from the Shire toward this grander quest, as your players advance in level, they too will move into more dangerous areas. But there's not going to be any sort of army that's ever going to overrun the Shire. There's not going to be any sort of major threat to come. I think it was like Bilbo's great-grandfather that chased the last dragon out. You can always stick to that idea. And from the Shire, we move on to Brandywine River. Now, he meets up with Peregrine and Mary. You have the incident with Farmer Maggot. The first time that they're really hiding from a ringwraith, Dark Rider, is when they try to make their escape to Brandywine River, and they realize that we just can't follow the roads, we just can't follow the path as presented, because something is after us. They know they have a very valuable ring, they're just not sure what this ring is for. So after Brandywine River, and I'm not going to try to describe the stories themselves. One, it'd be a little bit more of a spoiler, even though there's going to be some spoilers in here. Everyone knows, hopefully, that I'm either seeing the adaptation or it's become so much of the colloquial nature of English language that we all know Tolkien. I think his book is many times over been called the greatest work of the modern age, because it's so well loved and it's so widely read. So I'm going to treat it as that as well. But I'm not going to try to go into the intricacies. I'm not going to bring the book up and read passages. I mean, that would be very lovely, and there are people who do that and study it all. But I'm sort of showing this from a role-play construction. Brandywine River. We move to the Old Forest. It sort of cheeses me off that most of the adaptations, the Rake Baths and Peter Jackson's, they just skip the whole idea of the Old Forest. They may hint at it, with trees grabbing the hobbits, but no. The Old Forest and Tom Bombadil is a major portion of The Lord of the Rings. And Tom Bombadil especially, that spirit of the Old Forest that isn't properly defined. Is he like a Gandalf character, or is he even older? I'm sure there's somebody who's read the Silmarillion and all the appendixes and read this inside out. I'll call him Stephen Colbert. will correct me, but I don't have the time and I don't have the interest. But I do know when I read the stories and I finally got to the Old Forest, I really started getting interested. All of the stuff before that in The Lord of the Rings is, oh my gosh, can we please just get to a little bit more action, a little bit more pace? But the Old Forest was delightful, both in the fact that Tom Bombadil shows up to save them from the Old Man Willow, and also he has a sanctuary there, and he's the one that helps them along their way, essentially just puts them on the path. And as we move to the next step here you'll see that they move into the Barrow Downs. Now the Barrow Downs is Barrow Wights are just resurrected dead spirits, and they are attacked by those, and again Tom Bombadil comes to the rescue. Now most of the adaptations are going to skip right to Bree, which is the next thing you see, but I'll go back for just a second. If you look at what's being formed here now in the campaign, you have Brandywine River, which looks like it's a non-navigable river, maybe a little wider to keep the horses. I'm assuming that the undead ringwraiths, as undead, cannot cross running water. The old forest of Tom Bombadil is also keeping things a little safer, and then you've got this huge area of the Barrow Downs. So if anyone from Bree, any humans or any dwarves who live in Bree, it seems to be one of the first big collective trade towns. If any adventurers are coming from Bree, the first thing they'd hear is that Barrow Downs, and they would go, there ain't no way I'm going to go to the Barrow Downs. And then by most paths, people wouldn't hug the coast. They would go straight on. They'd hit those impenetrable mountains. So after impenetrable mountains, Barrow Downs, and then even if they did hug the coast, if they come along in the Old Forest and Tom Bombadil knew they were just mischief maker and he chases them off, this is why the Shire is isolated. This is why there is nothing coming into that area. Add to that, the tundra north and the icy seas, and you get the idea that suddenly now we have in the story a Shire that isn't even aware of the rest of the world, nor does it matter to them that there's a rest of the world. How am I doing on time? Still pretty good. Let me speed up a little bit. But Bree, Sign of the Prancing Pony, we move from there. And then Aragorn takes them they meet up with Aragorn the Ranger. He takes them to Weathertop, and from there, you have the chase to the river crossing, and then that brings us to Rivendell. Now, there's going to be purists who are going to scream bloody murder going, Rivendell's right next to the Misty Mountains. Again, if you're going to follow verbatim what the story is saying, that isn't even correct as well, because it will hint that these things are in territories with one another. It isn't going to trace every step these characters take. The story moves forward in episodes, in chapters, or in adventures. But let's dwell on that for just a little bit. Now, why didn't they go south? Why didn't Aragorn, after Bree, take them south? He could possibly have gotten to Rivendell a long way around, but south of Bree is the area of Dunland. Now, not in Tolkien's map. In Tolkien's map, there's about 10 kingdoms that are south of Bree, and Bree, of course, is about 120 miles over to the east from where I'm putting it. But if you look at Bree, if you actually went south of Bree, you're going to have the forces of Dunland. Now, the Dunland forces are also going to be recruited. The hill people of Dunland are going to be recruited by Saruman to help fight for his cause of controlling the ring. Dunland would be a wild area. There would be towns, and there would be villages, and there would be chieftains, but they would mostly be people who would just rob and steal, and generally would not be kind to anyone. These are your levels 2 to 5 type of annoyances that the characters would run in. And why don't we go north from Bree? Well, you got the Bewitched Realms. Certainly the Witch King of Angmar. I think he is actually the Lord of the Nazgul, so he has a realm up here that's marked on the map. It shows it as an icy kingdom on the end of the Misty Mountains, but I'm just moving a little bit farther over. So we're locked between Dunland and the Bewitched Realms. You have the relatively more, not peaceful, but relatively more medieval, rangerly Bree, and there would be a struggle between the incursions and the raids from Dunland and the threat of the Bewitched Realms, the Barrow Downs to the west. Bree would be seen as the last vestige of civilization as you move in that direction. The old kingdom that was centered around Weathertop was destroyed, probably in raids by the Dunlands and attacks by the rising Bewitched Realms of Ice King. And from Rivendell we move on. I think we've gotten to the point where for Rivendell, yep, I think we have... Oh, before I forget, the protection of Elron. So in between the Bewitched Realms and Dunland, you have the protection of Elron. The protection of Elron would be an area that's sort of guarded by the elf patrols. And the elves as well, because their Grey Havens obviously are all the way to the west, they would need to get to the watermass, probably south of Bree as a landing point. But they would want to protect the area between Dunland and the Bewitched Realms. Are we out of book 1 yet? Yes. Okay. Let's go on to book 2. Now, I left some references there just so you can see it. But we'll start off with the Misty Mountains. That's sort of that world spine. That world spine is very important because what it represents is like a wall. It's like a Great Wall of China. It's something that cannot be crossed except at specific places. So as your party of adventurers have left the relative safety of Rivendell and crossed through the protectorate of Elron and his immortals, everything is safe until they decide where they're going to try to cross at. And there's very few places to cross. Now, what Gandalf does is he tries to use the same crossing that they use in The Hobbit. He uses the Snowy Pass. They go to the Snowy Pass as the Fellowship of the Ring. But of course, any access to the Snowy Pass is being blocked by Saruman from Isengard. Now, I have moved Isengard probably about 100-150 miles from the end of the spine in the Misty Mountains to that side. Because what I want to do is I want to reposition the map so that instead of having those 8 or 9 worthless freaking kingdoms, I have the actual politics of the Lord of the Rings books. Now, Isengard will be at the end of the Isen River, right there next to the mountains itself. And let me add another thing here, Fangorn. Now, throughout Book 3 especially, Fangorn and the Imps, now Fangorn is a mysterious wood. People would not want to enter Fangorn, especially if the Ents, who are near immortal, near invincible, can just crush you with a heartbeat. The idea of these giant oaks and giant elms, the way they can dig into the soil, they can tear apart the rock like they do eventually to the walls around Isengard. Now, I assume that there's a pass at Isengard, and that pass at Isengard, I think it's even mentioned in the story, although with Tolkien's map it's a little bit farther south. That pass at Isengard would be a passage that you can move through from one side of the Misty Mountains to the other side. So when Gandalf tries to move the party through the Snowy Pass, but just is thwarted, or in The Hobbit, they try to move through the Snowy Pass, but they have to actually go into the Goblin Mines because the stone giants are throwing stones at each other. Hobbit is a good story. At Isengard, you have a pass that leads into Fangorn and Fangorn Forest, and the whole area is mysterious. And while the White Wizard used to walk in Fangorn Forest as a friend, now in the time of Lord of the Rings, he's lost that status. He's equal to Gandalf as one of the 9 protecting wizards. I sort of wonder what happened to the other 6 or 7. Maybe they're dead, but I know Radagast the Brown appears briefly, I think in early chapter of Lord of the Rings he appears, but then you don't see him ever again. But Saruman originally captures Gandalf, and then Gandalf gets free with the help of the Eagles. Oh, the Eagles, gosh. Boy, if there's ever been a Deus Ex Machina of any stories, it's the Eagles. And they come to save in The Hobbit, they come to save in the Lord of the Rings, the Eagles are to do everything. Well, okay. But you got Isengard and the River Isen, and Fangor is just on the other side through the pass of Isengard, the Misty Mountains. Westamnet and Eastamnet. Boy, those are Anglo names, as opposed to Westerland and Easterland, and those are of Rohan. Instead of having all these idle kingdoms, what you have is the large expanse, and probably Rohan is more of a herding, I picture, a village type of riders. They would be more like Cossacks or Mongols. They ride back and forth across these large grasslands between the Westamnet and the Eastamnet, and they are south of Isengard still for the strategy of the books, but they stand between Dunland and Isengard, and the people of Dunland probably hate the Westamnet because, let's face it, over the years Dunland would try to take territory in Westamnet. Westamnet would come back and punish the Dunland people for doing so. Westamnet would try to expand up into Protector of Elron, and Elron would push them back so they would have fear of the elves, stay away from them. And again, Isengard, while Saruman was a relatively neutral good wizard, would probably be a mitigating force to try to broker deals between the elves, the hill tribe humans, and the riders of Rohan. And then we move on. The Snowy Pass is blocked. So what happens? Because the Snowy Pass is blocked, they debate. Should they risk going through Isengard? Can they stealth through? Can Gandalf cast an invisibility spell? Gandalf doesn't really seem to have any spells. He's a wizard without magic. He does have a nice blade. So they decide that they're going to use Gimli's suggestion, and they're going to go through the Mines of Moria. That's the English pronunciation from the radio version. Mines of Moria. Moria, as most people call it. So they decide to go north into the Mines of Moria. Now, you can notice that I transposed them. Normally the Mines of Moria are further to the south. Mines of Moria is supposed to be a safe place. Now, and they don't know they've been overrun by the goblins. Part of the reason why they don't go there is because they worry that the dwarf kings own that area are just going to either delay their passage or add politics to the whole situation, especially with the elf at the party. And that elf is a Mirkwood-style elf, and there's always struggles between dwarves and elves, especially as the map will expand, you'll see. So the Mines of Moria, they go through that, and then Gandalf is killed. They have to exit onto the plain, and they exit on the plain right through into Lorien. Now, Lorien is actually, in Tolkien's word, is more where Fangor is, and then Fangor is down further south. But it makes more sense that Lorien is, again, in this area of the forest here. And what is on either side of Lorien? Well, what you have is just to the north you have the Iron Hills, and even further than that you have a northern waste. So when Gandalf is thinking about the world, he's going, well, there's no way we'd survive. We don't have the supplies, we don't have the temperament to travel the northern waste. And after Gandalf is killed in the Mines of Moria, Aragorn's making a decision. He's in Lorien, and he trusts the elves, and so he's not going to go to the Iron Hills again. Plus, it's in the opposite direction from where Mount Doom is. He's going to head south. And heading south from Lorien, eventually what he's going to run into is all those orcs that were created by Saruman going through the Pass of Isengard, where finally you get the attack of the Uruk-hai by the river, and Boromir is slain. And we go on to Book 3. Now in Book 3, notice we get a different perspective here, and again, the elves of Elron are leaving, and the elves of Lothlorien are leaving. Despite Peter Jackson's decision to add them into the Battle of Helms Deep. In the stories themselves, there aren't our elves at Helms Deep. The elves are leaving. They've just decided, hey, we've had enough. We don't like the politics. We've been around for thousands and thousands of years. It's time for us just to mass suicide, mass die. So I put them sort of in an orange, that they're no longer to be here. You can see where the death of Boromir is. You still got Isengard, and we have the party has been split. Book 3 is my favorite book of the 6 books. It's all action. It's a well-focused saga from beginning to end. It's a well-focused telling of each little event that comes along. And where do we go from here? Well, you still have the dwarves in the Iron Hills, and if you think about the politics of all this, the elves are leaving, so what are the dwarves going to do? Are the dwarves going to really raise an army and help fight Sauron, or meddle with Saruman? They figure, well, that can happen 3 or 4 generations from now. And the dwarves really would think, well, I'm more of a person that can control the underworlds, and we still, we got our asses kicked at Moria, or Moria, if you really want to think about it. So maybe we can't fight goblins and orcs, but they're looking at a power vacuum where they can take over parts of Lothlorien, can try to retake the Mines of Moria. They can even pass by the Misty Mountains and try to take all the hills and mountains around Elrond's area. They can even grab Rivendell as a free prize. There's all those hills between the Witch Realms and Dunland. They may want to go all the way over to where the Barrow Downs is and start mining dwarven areas there. And I think early on, especially when Bilbo leaves, he leaves in the accompaniment of dwarves. So they're probably the dwarves that live under the mountains. Wherever you see mountains, you probably have dwarves. So the Iron Hills is just seeing this as an opportunity. That's why they're probably not a major player. And Fangorn, again, let's get back to that. Part of the story in Book 3 is the fact that when Merry and Pippin get abducted by the Uruk-hai, they get dragged all the way to Fangorn Forest, and when they flee into it, after the Rohirrim kill the Uruk-hai, what's left of them, that's where they're going to meet the Treebird, forgive me, and they're going to have this, essentially, this episode where they have to convince Treebeard to join the war. It's sort of a neutral party that needs to join the war. And then we're going to have the Riders of Rohan. Now, the Riders of Rohan are a major part of the story in the fact that they cannot deal with the fact that they're going to deal with Dunland, and they're going to have to deal with Isengard as an enemy, but also they have their king, Theoden, is controlled by Grima Wormtongue through Saruman's magic. The Riders of Rohan are in a flee mode, and they're essentially going to flee away from the attackers in Dunland who've chosen a side. They say, we're going to ally with Saruman here. The elves are departing, and so we can have the lands of the Riders. Isengard is thinking, if I get the ring, I can do whatever I want. Fangorn is always that mysterious place. People don't go into it. And from the Rise of Rohan, they retreat to Helms Deep. I put Helms Deep where I did, and instead of further down, you'll notice in Tolkien's map, all of this suddenly condenses into like a 50-mile inch of the big map. You got 1,000 miles, and then all the action in Lord of the Rings in Book 3 suddenly takes place in 50 miles. It's nonsense. Let it expand over hundreds of miles. But it does bring up a point. If Helms Deep is where it is, Isengard is where it is, originally, how do you get Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas, again, who knows what the pronunciation is, really over to the Riders of Rohan? And that's where I bring into Dunharrow. Now, Dunharrow is sort of that spooky land. It's really part of Rohan, but it's also claimed somewhat by Gondor. But it's an area where it used to be allied to the kings of Gondor before it betrayed them. And after it betrayed them, all the people were cursed to live as spirits. So I added Dunharrow where it is. So if you're not happy with the ranger, an elf, and a dwarf being able to come through the pass of Isengard to catch up with the Riders of Rohan, or if you're not happy with, is it Arwen? Forgive me if I get that wrong. One of the Riders of Rohan killing the Uruk-hai over next to Fangorn, they also just came through Dunharrow. And if they're riding on horseback as fast as they can, sleeping very little, the spirits of Dunharrow would be more confined to the mountains and the hills, and they would leave those people alone. But that would be the passage, essentially, that Aragorn would eventually have taken, and that would be the chapter that doesn't appear. It appears over in Book 5, but it doesn't really appear in Book 3. Which brings us to Book 4. Now, Book 4 would be Frodo and Sam tame Smeagol. That's the first step of Book 4. Book 4 is they tame Smeagol after they separate, and their separation, you can notice the river fork up. I should have marked on my map, forgive me. The river fork where Boromir died, and so they head off, probably partially the way by river with their boat, and then they finally decide that we're going to get caught by Aragorn and company, and they can't trust the humans anywhere around the ring, so they head off on their own. And they start to enter an area which is the Brownlands. Now, the Brownlands is a maze. Now, it's not really shown on the map. It's maybe shown as this sort of a bunch of gray hill-like areas, but the Brownlands are a larger area, and it's really just a tangle. It's a broken terrain. It's easy to get lost. There's probably magic involved with it that was cast ages ago to keep people from finding the direction. And it's close to the battle plains, and the battle plains seem to be a centralized area that when any of the large forces of Middle-earth want to fight, Mordor versus Lakemen, Mordor versus Iron Hills, Mordor versus Mirkwood Elves, they'll meet on the battle plains. I think the battle plains is also where they first met to defeat Sauron when he was in human form. At the end of The Hobbit, I think there's a resurrection of Sauron at the bottom of the Mirkwood in a necromancer's keep. But the battle plains, I think, go all the way back to the Silmarillion and the killing of the first time of Sauron. But Frodo and Sam were probably not aware of any of that. They don't know any of the history of the world. They were living in isolation in the Shire, and so they go south into the Brownlands. That's where they tame Smeagol. And now Smeagol's going to be their guide. So they're totally dependent upon Smeagol. And this is very good for a player character, roleplay type of aspect. You always want that, don't trust the players to understand where they need to go next. This whole idea of this open concept, sandbox approach, it just is an endless amount of work for you as a referee. You got the story moving in a direction. Give the players a patron, give the players a guide. From the Brownlands, we end the Dead Marsh. The Dead Marsh was where probably all the bodies from the battles that have happened in the battle plains are either dumped by the winner or buried unceremoniously by fleeing, deserting winners. And then I've added a whole bunch of stuff here. because they approach the Black Gate. When they reach the Black Gate, Smeagol convinces Sam and Frodo there's no way they're going to sneak their way through, even with the elven cloaks, and that Smeagol knows the secret way. I added a few extra things here. You got the Elves of Mirkwood, you got Gimli's dwarves in the far north, his kinsmen, and you got the Lakemen and what I've called the Lure of the Ring. Now this normally would be the Sea of Roar, and it's totally undefined what's happening in any of those in the Lord of the Rings. I added the Lakemen further down and Lonely Mountain a little bit further up. If I redo The Hobbit, I'll show you those sort of repositionings. But the Lakemen, Frodo is already can't trust Aragorn, essentially a righteous paladin. Why would he ever decide to go in that direction? Plus, again, he knows by now he can start to see the plumes of the fires of Mount Doom. So he knows the direction he needs to go. He just doesn't know how to get into it. There's no way he's going to go to the Lakemen. They would have too much of a Lure of the Ring. Gimli's dwarves are really far to the north. We've already passed them. Plus, if Gimli is the only example of the dwarves, there's no way Frodo and Sam is going that direction. He may like the elves, but he may have read Bilbo's tale there and back again. How about the elves of Mirkwood were really mischievous. They were not. They were almost insane. So he's going to trust Smeagol again, and Smeagol tells him, well, from the Black Gate, what we need to do is we need to go south, and a lot further south, and because Smeagol knows a secret way. Well, player characters, on you go. The next part of the story takes us to Cirith Ungol, and essentially the Lord of the Nazgul, his keep. That's where he's marshalling the forces of Mordor for the attack over to Gondor, and Osgiliath. Now, Osgiliath has not been captured yet. In fact, Frodo and Sam are captured by the rangers around Osgiliath. They're called the Bard people in some other roleplay games, and here it's Boromir's brother, so Frodo has to deliver the news that Boromir is dead. Of course, they found his broken horn earlier anyway, washed down the river. At Osgiliath, Faramir makes the best decision of the Lord of the Rings when he decides he's not going to take the ring to his father. And not enough, I think, is said about that. The selflessness of that, the omniscience of that to know this is the right move. Because in the lands of Mordor, the eye of the Dark Lord is focused solely on the strongest person, like Saruman, who's going to try to get my ring. It is totally beyond his understanding that anyone would, one, try to destroy it, or two, would entrust it to essentially helpless people that could easily be taken by a patrol of Gondor as Osgiliath. They talk a little about the Haradwaith. I picture this as sort of a Saharan or a Gobi-style desert. If you go further down on the map, there's just nothing there. Eventually, you'll hit a shoreline, and eventually you're going to hit the southern polar ice caps. So the whole Middle Earth is a much smaller planet than our own. This is it. These are all the people that are going to be affected. If Saruman takes the ring, he's going to capture the whole globe. The Haradwaith, a sparsely populated area that just is not going to have any politics involved with this. And eventually they get to Shelob's Lair. Now I moved Shelob's Lair. Shelob's Lair is, in the books, is right on top of Cirith Ungol. That doesn't make any sense. If Shelob's Lair was that close and the ring was that close, the Lord of the Nazgul would sniff it out. And so I had to move him really far away. It would be an area of isolation that maybe only a Gollum would know, because he escaped the Dark Lord. And the best way to escape the Dark Lord and get through any of these impenetrable mountains is not going past the Lord of the Nazgul, not trying to penetrate the Black Gate, but to find, some sort of underworld, some sort of dungeon-style environment like Shelob's Lair. And the narrative there is some of the best that Tolkien puts together with his. So from Shelob's Lair, we got the Plateau of Gorgoroth. It's very, very close to the biblical Golgotha. And you can see the Christian influence of Tolkien here, that he would name this sort of plain of destruction, plain of the goblin, Gorgoroth, after Golgotha, is my assumption. And have we finished? That, I think, takes us to the end of Book 4. And at this point, I think Frodo is presumed dead. And I haven't read Lord of the Rings recently. I never even finished the first time. And I remember from the movies, Sam never puts on the ring. Sam put on the ring. He left a dead Frodo behind, and then realizes later that Frodo is not dead. We go to Book 5. We're getting very near the end. And most of these things are running about an hour. So, if you enjoy the other ones of an hour, you'll enjoy this one. And what we have here is the Book 5 is a Gondor struggle, and you have Minas Tirith, it's in the middle there, the Haradraith, and you also have the distant lands of the Haradrim. That's where the Olifants come from. Mordor has convinced other people to help him on his struggle. The battle plains again, the Brownlands, Dead March, and you have the Eye and Cirith Ungol, where they're marshalling the forces, and we're going to come across with the led by the Lord of the Nazgul. Dunharrow. Well, instead of focusing right there, we talked a lot about Minas Tirith. I think Gandalf has taken Shadowfax and ran with Pippin there as a distraction. Aragorn leaves the Riders of Rohan under their king and tells them that I have other business, and he travels into Dunharrow to raise all those dead spirits, the men that betrayed Gondor. Cleanse your souls by coming with me. It's a wonderful role-play sort of element of convincing the ghosts to come and help the cause. From there, you got the Ride of the Rohirrim. The Ride of Rohirrim I've pictured in the southern part where I repositioned Gondor. Probably should have put the big Gondor logo on that. You can see from the big map at the end. So from Eastamnet, they're going to essentially ride what looks like to be about 300 miles. And they're going to do that maybe in, 50, 70 miles a day. They're going to ride for about 3 or 4 days to reach Minas Tirith at a full stride. As we move on, the attack from Cirith Ungol eventually takes Osgiliath. Faramir is routed when he goes back to his father. His father tells him to go take it. He almost gets killed, except for Gandalf's intervention. And the Rohirrim are still riding. And why did I put this in? The ships of the Belfalast Pirates. Because after Aragorn resurrects these dead to come help in the battle, and the dead probably can instantly appear around Minas Tirith, but they're probably going to stay around the last king. And so Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas have to get to Minas Tirith, and they don't have Shadowfax. They're always going to be a day behind and a day late. So I imagine them moving to the passes and following the same path of Rohirrim, of the Riders of Rohan, but deciding then to go down the river by ship and seize the pirate ships, which, would have been another threat to Minas Tirith. And when they seize those pirate ships, then they're going to travel along the coast and up the river to Minas Tirith and aid the battle at the very end. And we move to the next step, Pelennor Fields. This is where Peter Jackson really did himself proud. Boy, that Battle of Pelennor Fields will never be better reenacted, although I think Mary and Gal from Rohan, I think that has some technical errors. But okay. But Pelennor Fields, you finally get the fact that, Gandalf is fighting from inside Minas Tirith. The Olifants have stormed the field. There's a huge cloud moved from Mount Doom to cover the field so that the orcs, which normally cannot fight in daylight, can fight. And wonderful narrative. And what turns the day, of course, is the Aragorn with his undead fleet disgorging outside of Minas Tirith and mopping the field with them. But even after that happens, it's mentioned that there is he calls them the South Runs. Now the South Runs seem like they're the more opportunistic Gondorians. So half of Gondor is saying, well, we've been under the stewardship anyway, we have a real king. We might as well side with the bad guy and help run the place. It's better to serve evil than die to evil. It's mentioned that they need to mop up the South Runs, bold, grim men, as they're described. And then from there, I think we're done with Book 5. Oh, nope, I got some political aspects. Why did Mordor lose this battle? Because he seems like Dark Lord Sauron had a lot more forces. He certainly does, the way they come out the Black Gate later on in Book 6. And he does have a lot more forces. He didn't commit all his forces, because I think he was maybe looking to see if the orcs lost, or if the Haradrim lost, or if any of his allies lost. He did not want to lose the protection. He only has to protect the lands of Mordor from his perspective, 2 places, the Black Gate and Cirith Ungol. So he's not going to use all his forces. He was worried, was so focused on the ring and so focused on his battle at Pelennor that he's not realizing that the elves are leaving. Elrond's mortal sons, his elven heroes, can always be approaching from the Brownlands, so he has to keep some forces back in case those guys, which are a more sizable threat. The conquest of Gondor, that can happen over hundreds of years, if Mordor is immortal and he actually gets the ring. He would be more worried about Saruman. The fact that Saruman lost his army is known to him through the Palantir, but probably since Saruman still lives, he's again a bigger threat. So he's worried about the threat approach from the elven heroes. He's also worried about the threat from the dwarven heroes or the men of the lake coming down. Now he does have these run scavengers. So the run scavengers, they weren't good enough thieves, and they're more of a reserve troop in that area that can march onto the battle plains or attack from the rear. If any of these other forces come to try to besiege the Black Gate, there'd be another force of men. And you look at the map and you go, oh, can't you just go around these things? Well, you could, except for, I got a little twist going on in the lands of Mordor, as you'll see in Book 6. But the run scavengers are one side, the distant lands of the Haradrim, you really have to go through Cirith Ungol or the Black Gate. A lot of the forces of Mordor were kept in reserve. And which brings us to Book 6. Let's get in the end. You'll note that I put a little caveat in here. I've only read the first 3 chapters of, and I really mostly skipped to what happened to the ring. What happened to the ring. I was more interested in that. I was really starting to get fatigued by Lord of the Rings. I was reading it, I think, when I was 14. I haven't tried to reread it since then. Every time I pick it up and try to get through Bilbo's party, I just put it aside and go, I don't have enough time for life to do this. I have time in life to do this presentation, but I don't have time in life to read the Lord of the Rings. Probably a little bit of that, both astigmatism and a little bit of dyslexia takes a little bit of the fun out of reading. I love the adaptations, though. I'll take nothing away from them except for the fact, Tom Bombadil, if you're going to do a 10-part series of Lord of the Rings, make sure you have Tom Bombadil in there. Or if you want to redo something, please give me a mini-series of Harry Potters and really cover those books in depth, because the Harry Potters were great movies, but there's so much more, I'm sure, that were in those stories that would be better as 10-episode story arcs. Do them on HBO for the gratuitous nudity as well, please. We're here in Book 6. You got the battle plains. The late arriving Haradrim Oliphants. Anyone who's ever read history knows that an army stages. It doesn't just all of a sudden appear at one point, so there would be late arriving Oliphants. The impregnable lands of Mordor. What makes them so impregnable? Well, Mount Doom, I picture, is not having crisscrossed by nice irrigation canals from its rivers, but these are just probably rivers of lava. And those rivers of lava would be so important in a fantasy roleplay campaign to also keep the players bounded. So they would say, well, why can't I go all the way around? Well, you're going to have to deal with the Oliphants, and you're going to have to cross the rivers of lava. And do you want to go through Shelob's Lair again? You can't take an army through Shelob's Lair. You got to go through either the Keep of Minas Morgul with your army, or you're going to have to go through the Black Gate. And this is where Aragorn understands the tactical nature of all this. Now, on the map, it's pretty stupid. And here's why. It's pretty stupid in that the Eye of Sauron can look west on Tolkien's map and pretty much see Mount Doom and the Black Gate. But the way I've drawn it, the Eye of Sauron has to turn around and look at the Black Gate and turn his gaze away from the fires of Mount Doom, turn totally away from where he would be able to see the hobbits approaching, and instead has to focus on the Black Gate. Gondor and Aragorn decide that we're going to take our remaining forces, and if there's anything we're going to do to help Frodo, especially when they get word that Frodo was alive from Faramir, they need to draw the eye and the forces away. And so the combined forces under King Aragorn assemble at the Black Gate. We get the Mouth of Sauron. It's a wonderful outtake scene if you have the extended versions of The Lord of the Rings. It's also a pretty good part of those chapters of the reading of The Lord of the Rings. And so he assembles there so the Eye of Sauron is focused with his dark reserves on the last of the ring race, defending the Black Gate, and focused on the king that came back. And because of that focus, he's totally turned his back on where the path of Frodo and Sam are going. So they're going to be in the southern area, heading toward the fires of Mount Doom. And we're almost to the end of our chapter, and we're almost to the end of our time. And after he tosses the ring in, you get the Gandalf and the Eagles. Oh my gosh. You mean Gandalf could have been given the ring 4 books earlier and just flown there with the Eagles, and then when he lands, he could have just thrown it in? And even if he didn't trust himself, he could have just took one of the hobbits. Well, the hobbits don't even throw it in, right? Well, is that a big spoiler or not? But, yeah, Gandalf and the Eagles. You could fly anywhere in the world with an unkillable eagle force, and some people argue, but the Nazgul would stop him. Well, didn't stop him there at the end. Okay, well, he flies there with the Eagles and rescues. Did I cover everything? I'll do a broad perspective for a minute if you'll indulge me. So, you have the Shire on one end of the world. And couldn't they just go, couldn't they do like Columbus and sail a little bit and end up in the land of the Haradrim and then come through the back door of Mordor? Yeah, that would be the players doing that if you sandbox it enough. No, those seas over there would tear your ships apart. Shire, the Brandywine River, Old Forest, the Barrow Downs, Bree, Weathertop, River Crossing. Oh, look at I spelled it wrong. Yeah, I'm going to leave that in there as my Persian flaw. A crossing, Rivendell, the protectorate of the Elron and the Elves, takes them to choices. Snowy paths. And he's not going to go down through Isengard. He was a captive of Saruman. At the Mines of Moria, he realizes that this is all death. They end up Gandalf dying, killed by the Balrog. They end up in Lothlorien, lots of gifts there, lots of important gifts. That Light of Galadriel is what saves him in Shelob's lair. Death of Boromir, the tragedy of Boromir, it's the corruption of the ring. One side goes into Fangorn. They make that little dog lair around Dunharrow, or they sneak their way through Isengard. Part not read in the story. And down the River Isen, where we fight with the Riders of Rohan. Gandalf, resurrected, rallies the people who have fled. Theodosius' son, he takes those guys and relieves them at Helms Deep. Aragorn separates and goes through Dunharrow. The Riders of Rohan run through the passes to go into the realm of Gondor to defend Minas Tirith, their capital. Frodo, on the other hand, is separated after the death of Boromir. He has to meet up with Sméagol, tame Sméagol. Sméagol later turned back into Gollum, but that's happening after Osgiliath. The Brownlands, the Dead Marsh, the Blackgate, Osgiliath. Gollum is cruelly treated at Osgiliath, betrays, not till he gets all the way to Shelob's lair, but he doesn't get the ring back, not till the very end. And it's only that look in his face from the adaptations of how betrayed he was when he finally realizes what it was to lose the ring, desire it for so long, only to get it back and realize that it will be the death of us all. The lands of Mordor, from its Blackgate, the Barad-dûr, the Tower of the Eye, and the fires of Mount Doom with the lava rivers. Well, enough said. Hope you enjoyed my reworking of the map of Middle-earth into a workable RPG campaign, and also as a testament to the fact that, please, just, if you're writing a fantasy novel, we don't need all of the backstory. It's okay. You don't even need it to write one. And if you're making a campaign, boy, please, sandbox? No. Just make sure the parties that are defined will come into play. More later.